Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today, we are joined by Dr. Dmitry Suslov to discuss Russia's strategic position across several connected fronts, the war in Ukraine, Armenia's post-election pivot towards the West, the TRIPP in the South Caucasus, and the long-term confrontation between Russia and a rearming Europe. Dr. Suslov is a Russian political scientist, foreign policy analyst, and commentator specializing in great power politics, especially Russia-US relations, European security, and the evolving international order.
Friends, before we go to Dr. Suslov, thank you for your support and your previous contributions. We do a lot to bring you this independent type of coverage. Some of these guests you will not see anywhere else in Armenian media, and we think it's important to hear all sides. Dr. Suslov is a very well-spoken commentator on Russian policy, and I think you will enjoy this show greatly. There are no corporate or government shows here. We do not get funding from any 3-letter, 4-letter, 5-letter agency. This is mostly 99% funded by OSPED and I so far, and we're just looking to also offload some of that burden onto willing supporters. So if you can support us in any way financially, then go to podcasts.groong.org/donate and help us cover the costs for producing these podcasts and also increasing the speed at which we bring you these episodes and increasing the content that we produce as well. All right, on to the show.
Dr. Suslov, welcome back to the Groong podcast.
Hello, and thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Suslov. We really enjoyed our last conversation with you, and we appreciate you coming back again.
Thank you.
Let's start with Ukraine, if possible. Now, Russian sources and pro-Russian sources and analysts describe recent battlefield developments as meaningful advances towards the Donbas fortress belt. The most significant development is the reported capture of the town of Konstantinovka. Now, Western officials and Ukrainian sources deny these same developments and frame them as minor Russian gains over ruins and rubble, while insisting that Ukraine's long-range strike capability and NATO-backed production base are expanding. And we heard some of that during the recent NATO summit in Ankara. So can you tell us, from your perspective, is Russia making real operational progress in Donbass, or is this essentially a slow grind conflict that is attritional in nature?
Well, I think that Russia is making slow progress, but it is a war of attrition, and there is an escalation going on at the same time. So, of course, there is progress because Russia is moving forward. And you correctly said about the capture of Konstantinovka, that's a very important town on the way to Slavyansk-Kramatorsk. Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are the last remaining places, cities, or towns in the Donbas area still under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. And Konstantinovka was is an extremely significant defensive line on the way to them. So capturing Konstantinovka really brings Russia closer to capturing the whole Donbass. So that's a very, very important step forward. At the same time, of course, the progress is slow because we are not witnessing a maneuver warfare, and maneuver warfare is impossible due to the abundance of drones. Now, drones dominate the battlefield, and the quality of drones and the quantity of drones, the abundance of them, basically makes it impossible to conduct a maneuver warfare, makes it impossible to concentrate forces, to operate with big, platoons or battalions or whatever. Actually, all the movements are made by individuals or couples of soldiers. The less the better, because the more people, the easier to be noticed and destroyed with the usage of drones. Of course, the factor of drones factors the defensive side, which is favors the defensive side, which is Ukraine, not Russia. So it is costly, of course, for Russia to move forward. So basically, the changed nature of war explains the pace, which is slow, and predetermines the nature of the warfare, which is the battle of attrition. And since Russia still maintains advantage in manpower, in artillery, even partially in drones, so Russia is moving forward. I have no doubts that the rest of Donbass will be taken in some observable future. But at the same time, you are also right that there is an escalation going on. And the nature of this escalation is deep strikes. Because Ukraine now puts the major emphasis on deep strikes against the Russian energy infrastructure. And the theory behind that is this, that if Ukraine, with the help of the West, with the help of Europe, destroys a significant portion of the Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, oil refineries, gas stations, pipelines, even power plants, it will, from their perspective, and from the Western perspective, it would be harder for Russia to continue the current intensity of war, right? Because the Russian approach is based on the assumption that Russia will afford fighting as long as it takes. And they want to destroy that, right? They want to compel Russia to make concessions. Basically political, very significant concessions. They want Russia to reject the demand that Russia must control the whole of Donbass, and they perceive those deep strikes as a means, to accomplish that, right? So
do you think this is a justified presumption?
Well, not necessarily. Of course, those deep strikes against civilian infrastructure, right? It needs to be emphasized. And they don't even conceal it. They claim that Ukraine should strike the Russian civilian infrastructure, in order to produce some civil unrest. In order to trigger domestic discontent in the Russian society, in order to inflict some economic problems on the Russian society, and by doing so, to increase the political pressure on the leadership. So they're making some damage without question, and Russia has faced certain problems such as the temporary deficit of gasoline. For instance, in the country, it's clear, but this damage is not critical. And what is important is that they will not be able to inflict such a critical damage that could hypothetically compel Russia to change its war objectives and to make significant concessions. Because this damage is felt, but it is manageable. It is manageable, right? Lots of reparations is being conducted quickly. Russia is strengthening its air defense, and Russia is the world leader in air defense, and so on and so forth. But more important even is that the escalation on the Ukrainian side is met logically with the escalation from the Russian side. Right, Russian response to the Ukrainian and Western-led escalation into the deep strikes, in terms of deep strikes into Russia, resulted in Russian acceleration of Russian deep strikes inside Ukraine, and Russia has started to conduct very regular and quite intensive strikes against Kiev, the Kiev city, and multiple objects inside Ukraine. And the intensity of Russian strikes against Ukraine and the damage which Russia inflicts on Ukraine, I would say is much more than the damage that Ukraine inflicts on Russia. And today, Russia has a certain advantage here, which is the deficit of the Ukrainian air defense systems. right? Because in addition to drones, multiple number of drones and cruise missiles, the means which Russia uses and the means which Ukraine lacks so far is ballistic missiles. And Ukraine simply does not have air defenses which are able to intercept the Russian ballistic missiles, right? And even officially, Ukraine claims that it misses, it can't intercept the Russian ballistic
So, Dr.
missiles.
Suslov, just in the last 2 days, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this when the NATO summit occurred in Ankara, I believe that President Trump authorized the sale or the making of Patriot air defense systems in Ukraine.
Right.
Is this going to cause some kind of a major problem?
No, not an immediate problem, I would say, because Ukraine needs the Patriot missiles here and now. Trump refused to provide Ukraine the missiles, the ready manufactured capable missiles right now. What he did is he provided the license for Ukraine to produce those missiles at the Ukrainian territory. It will be extremely lengthy and complicated issue which will take years if it happens at all. Because first, it's very difficult to produce such a complicated manufacturing in conditions of war. Because believe me, it will be one of the most prioritized targets for Russia. I strongly doubt, so that's number one. Number two, it's impossible even to start production without the presence of American experts on place. From Lockheed Martin, for instance, which produces those missiles in the United States. I strongly doubt that the American experts will be ready to go there while becoming targets simultaneously, right? Because of course Russia will look for them and will try to kill them, right? And will try to destroy everything which they try to build. Number three, it's a lengthy process. It's very lengthy and complicated process. Then there is a problem of the sharing of technologies. The United States is not very keen to share advanced technologies for Patriot missiles. Today, there are only two countries in the world which produce PAC-3, which is the most advanced version of the Patriot missile. These are the United States itself and Japan. PAC-2, which is a little bit outdated, is also produced in Germany, and that's it. Right, so I strongly doubt also that the United States will be quickly sharing the technologies, expertise, and everything else with Ukraine. Even in normal times, in times of peace and safety, it takes years. It takes years, to build and to build the plant and for the plant to become operational. And there is also the problem of supply chains, because not everything, not 100%, not all the components are produced right at place, right? There is the whole chain of production spread along the world, and there are lots of bottlenecks here. My prognosis is that at best, in several years from now, Ukraine could build this plant if it survives by that time. But it will not make any impact here and now when Ukraine is in the huge deficit of those air defense systems.
Yeah. Dr. Suslov, at the same time, in your answers, you said that Ukraine yet doesn't have that capability. You talked about air defense and also ballistic missiles. On the ballistic missile front, we have also developments that Ukraine is ostensibly developing its own capabilities, and there's criticism that it is essentially a rebranded Western missiles that will be developed or maybe shipped and just stamped in Ukraine as Ukrainian. So to me, this indicates like a race against time. And I'm wondering whether the slow nature of the conflict is coming right across, is in conflict itself with the time requirements for Russia to end this in a reasonable period. And some Russian analysts, for instance, Sergei Karaganov, argued that Russia should increase or the speed of the escalation, and potentially consider use of tactical nuclear weapons in order to ensure that this conflict ceases sooner than later, in order to minimize damage and in order to prevent significant rearming of Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I exclude the possibility of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine and against Ukraine. And when my teacher, actually, and my supervisor at the HEC University, Sergei Karaganov, talks about the hypothetical use of tactical nuclear weapons, he means Europe. He doesn't mean Ukraine. He means Europe as a result of a Russian-European direct clash, because if, God forbids, there is a direct military clash, direct, not a proxy war, but direct war between Russia and the European countries of NATO, without question, we will have the nuclear escalation. And I think that the risk of such a development is going up, because you are absolutely right, Hovik, that the missiles which Ukraine uses, increasingly uses and tries to obtain, are not necessarily Ukrainian. First and foremost, even the majority of missiles which Ukraine claims to produce are not entirely Ukrainian, right? And we know multiple places in Europe, in European countries, which actually produce those drones or the components of drones for Ukraine: short-range drones, middle-range drones, and long-range drones. The same refers to cruise missiles. There is a very much advertised, super advertised, even maybe over-advertised Ukrainian missile called Flamingo.
Yes.
But it's not Ukrainian, actually. It is a European missile, compiled from several European components. And again, they don't even conceal the direct participation of many European military companies, military industrial companies, the French, the German, in the production of this missile. The same is with the so-called Ukrainian ballistic missile, which does not exist yet. They claim to have an aspiration to produce it by this autumn, but we know again that this is not a Ukrainian missile, because even in the Soviet time, and especially in the post-Soviet time, Ukraine lacked the competence of production of ballistic missiles. You have to have the whole school of thought, if you want, right? And the legacy of thought, the whole science of ballistics. Ukraine never had it. And even if it had something, it was lost during the Soviet time. So it is the Western participation, right? And that's the point which Dr. Karaganov and many others in Russia, and some of the officials even claim, that the increasing number of deep strikes into Russia is not produced by Ukraine, right? This major change, yes, indeed, this is the major change in the war, which has occurred recently. The intensification of the Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia is conducted by the West, with the direct participation of the West, because the West produces, the West supplies, and the West targets and directs those those strikes, right? The West also provides the intelligence data, which allows those cruise missiles and drones to fly and hit and overcome the Russian air defenses. And again, the assumption is that this intensification of those deep strikes would eventually compel Russia to make fundamental compromises, and, for instance, accept the freezing of the war at the current battlefield. My assumption is that an opposite, a very different scenario could happen if they inflict too much damage, if the Russian leadership comes to conclusion that the current status quo or the future status quo is unsustainable, and that Russia simply cannot sustain really this abundance of deep strikes, again produced by the West, right? Because all the preparatory work is done by the West. A more prudent scenario is Russian escalation against the West. So far, Russia has escalated against Ukraine as a result of the Ukrainian escalation or the Ukrainian Western escalation against Russia. But I do not exclude at all the Russian escalation against the West as a result of that, because again, the roots of that problem, they all go to the West. And I think that this topic of escalation is in the air. So we are in a very dangerous process. This is why I said that, yes, there is this slow progress. There is still the war of attrition, but in addition to that, there is this escalatory component, which is clearly rising.
Yeah. Talking about the front lines, Dr. Suslov, some analysts and even Russian officials now argue that Russia's goals need to be expanded beyond Donbass and include Odessa, Kharkov, and the broader Novorossiya concept. Do you subscribe to that belief? We were talking recently with Dr. Margedonov, and he was saying that I think, he was of the camp that, Russia should be satisfied with capturing all of Donbass. But what are your thoughts? And is Novorossiya truly part of Russian strategic thinking, or is that potentially a threat for escalation? What is the current goal of Russia in terms of the
I think it largely depends on the Trump administration, because the agreement or the understanding at the Anchorage summit last year was that Russia would be satisfied with taking the whole of Donbass, and we will basically sacrifice the remaining part of Novorossiya, which is Kherson and Zaporozhye region, not under the Russian control. So if the Trump administration still subscribes under those conditions, which actually were formulated by the Trump administration itself, then Russia will definitely stick to that position and keep that position. If Trump administration, under the pressure or advice, maladvice, by the way, of the Europeans and Ukrainians, goes away from that position and starts demanding that Russia accepts the ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire at the current front line, then it would make no sense for Russia also to keep the agreement which the United States no longer keeps, right? It would be awkward for Russia to keep that agreement unilaterally, right? And in this case, of course, Russia will revise its war demands and aims, and probably return to the original position, or, well, not the very original position, or one of the longer previous positions, that the whole of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions should come to the Russian control. As for Odessa, of course, very many hawks and nationalists in Russia, those who claim that Russian demands should be more maximalist, they, of course, argue that Russia should cut Ukraine from the Black Sea completely. It makes sense, of course, from the military and strategic viewpoint. If Ukraine is completely cut from the Black Sea, it will probably cease to be a viable state. And if it ceases to be a viable state, it will no longer pose any danger, any security threat to Russia in the future. So it makes sense. But with the current military conditions, I see no way for Russia to basically accomplish that purpose, to take Odessa at a reasonable cost, at a cost which Russia could afford. Because again, with the factor of drones, which now dominates the battlefield, large-scale maneuver operations are not possible completely, right? Taking Odessa could be possible hypothetically if Ukraine cracks and collapses from within. And as a result of the Ukrainian collapse from within, there will be the crumbling and collapse of the front line, and then basically Russia would take Odessa without major resistance from the Ukrainian side. But it is not likely, to put it mildly, in the observable future.
This is a very interesting discussion. One thing I did not hear is any kind of a timeline to finishing this conflict. It's been 4.5 years. And I hesitate to ask because
the timeline is determined by the attrition of the sides, right? Today, both sides have diametrically opposite purposes, right? Of course, both sides are interested in ending the conflict, but the conditions are still too separate, too opposites for a compromise. So one of the sides should make a certain concession. Last year, the paradigm which was shared by the Trump administration was that Ukraine as a much weaker side, Ukraine as a side which was doomed basically for eventual attrition and defeat, was the one to make this concession for the sake of Ukrainian survival, actually. Now Ukraine and Europe is making all their best to convince the Trump administration that Russia will probably decide which will collapse from attrition or face a deep crisis from attrition quicker than Ukraine, right? And thus they claim that Russia should make a concession instead of Ukraine. We will see what is the position of the Trump administration, right? Because viewed from Moscow, now we have doubts, very serious doubts, that the Trump administration still keeps the conditions which it had offered itself again, right? This is very important last year. If it no longer keeps the proposal and keeps this agreement, then, as I said, Russia will revise its war aims, and of course will just continue fighting. I mean, because our understanding and our assumption is that we still have the advantage in terms of manpower, in terms of military industrial power, in terms of the intensity of strikes, and so on and so forth. So coming back to your original question, it's impossible to identify any time because because
how would you? You're right.
Because it is simply determined by the pace of attrition of the sides.
But let me ask a question. We have two more topics, where the Armenian, let's say, South Caucasus front, and then there's the whole rearming of Europe, which we want to talk about. But within that context, at least from the Armenian perspective, whenever we've heard about Russia's engagement in the South Caucasus, Russian line has been, it's very busy in Ukraine, and that is the top priority currently. Well, as Europe starts turning and becoming more militarized, arming itself, and some of the news is that they're going to put a lot of money, $70 billion, to infrastructure to help them move weaponry to their eastern front, meaning, the Russian front. Is Ukraine becoming just a pastime for them to keep this attrition going while they get ready for a larger war in 2030 or 2035 or whatever? In a sense, is Russia being just occupied constantly because all Europe has to do, all France and the UK have to do is just throw money at it, right?
And also, this it's not just France and France and European countries. There was, I believe, at the NATO summit, there was also a separate agreement between the UK and Turkey. Turkey is basically sitting on the side and enjoying this conflict while increasing its potential. And the agreement between the UK and Turkey includes, I think, self-defense, some mutual defense capabilities. So is Russia concerned about Turkish plus NATO plus European encroachment into the South Caucasus?
Well, absolutely. First, Russia is very much concerned about the European remilitarization, about this concept of NATO 3.0, which is the outsource of conventional deterrence and defense to the Europeans. And basically, Europe becoming responsible for the preparation of war against Russia. And the bad thing is that the Trump administration basically wants Europe to play this role, to invest more and more into the remilitarization and to prepare for a conventional war, hypothetical conventional war against Russia. But again, if this war, God forbids, happen, it will not be conventional. That's the point, right? And the usage of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, would be quite quick. So, of course, we are very much concerned about the European desire to prolong the conflict in Ukraine in order to win time for European remilitarization, right? Because today Europe lacks the military potential for a hypothetical clash vis-a-vis Russia. So they want Ukraine basically to become a shield and to win time for the Europeans, to pump their military muscles, to build factories, to build more capable armed forces, and so on and so forth, right? And this is why Europe is not interested.
I mean, that's exactly what's happening. In Ankara, Ursula von der Leyen basically said that the EU budget for defense is going to be over $200 billion in 2028. Well, I mean, that's a year and a half from now. Essentially, next year, their budgeting will start including $200 million. And Russia is looking at, of course, you're looking at the USA. Now you're going to be looking at the USE, the United States of Europe, spending a lot of money. And that money never sits in bunkers.
So this is a long-term threat. Well, NATO defined Russia as a long-term challenge or a long-term threat to the Euro-Atlantic community, but basically we see NATO and Europe, right, and the European part of NATO as a long-term threat. Confrontation between Russia and Europe, unfortunately, will be quite long, much longer than the military conflict in Ukraine itself. And Europeans, they want also to use Ukraine as a sword, as a military factor against Russia. First, to win time for their militarization. Second, also to use Ukraine as the first kind of expendable, in a hypothetical conflict with Russia. Right? They want Ukraine to play a role in any hypothetical military clash between Russia and Europe if it happens in the future, and they emphasize military integration between Europe and Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, and no one believes that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union in any hypothetical future. Because it will be suicidal for the EU, and actually the Central and Eastern European countries will be the first, and they are already the ones, take Poland, for instance, or witness Poland, right, which are resisting the actual economic integration of Ukraine into the European Union. But what they want is the military integration, right, the military integration, the integration of the military industrial complexes, right? Ukraine uses lots of what Europe produces, but also Europe wants to use much of the Ukrainian expertise, experience, and so on and so forth in the future. And Russia, of course, sees that link and the growing military integration between Ukraine and EU as a threat. And if we move to the political settlement negotiations, of course, Russia will insist on certain limits and revision of the current military integration between Ukraine and Europe. As for Turkey, of course, we have no illusions here as well. Russian-Turkish relations are partnership, but we perceive Turkey as a regional adversary, right? As a regional adversary, as a regional competitor in the South Caucasus, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and in Central Asia. I think
Probably
the
Africa
Turkish
too.
president,
Probably Africa too.
absolutely, absolutely. That's a paradox of Russia-Turkish relations, that you spot any place we are clashing with Turkey, but the whole paradigm is partnership still, right? And we need each other, by the way. I think President Erdogan did not conceal that Turkey helps Ukraine. The Turkey provides certain assistance to Ukraine. The Turkey wants Ukraine also not to be defeated, at least in this conflict. Turkey did play a role in providing Ukraine with drones, with some other weapons before, and probably continues to do that also now. Turkey, of course, wants a lot from the United States, like F-35s, for instance, from the United States. Turkey remains a country of NATO, a member of NATO. So we have no illusions, of course, about the Turkish role. As for the situation in the South Caucasus in general, well, yes, of course, the Russian position in the region has weakened over the recent time, unfortunately. As a result, not just of the Russian preoccupation with the Ukraine war, which took longer than Russia originally anticipated because of the Western penetration into this war, but also because of the Western role, right? Because Europe, but also the United States. And here I again see a combination and the convergence of the interests. Both Europe and the United States see South Caucasus as a region where Russia should be undermined, from which Russia should be basically kicked out. Europe wants another conflict zones vis-a-vis Russia in the South Caucasus. The United States simply wants to weaken the Russian position in the region and to increase the presence in the West. And unfortunately, Armenia is playing a growing role in the implementation of these policies.
Yeah. So this is a good segue for us to go to our next segment, which revolves around Armenia. There was a parliamentary election a month ago. And following that 2026 parliamentary election, Pashinyan's government appears to be accelerating Armenia's so-called Western pivot. Civil contract retained power and will have 3/5 majority, owing primarily to irregularities, which pushed prosperous Armenia, Gagik Tsarukyan's opposition party. And so this creates kind of a structural contradiction because Armenia's government is now going to start moving closer to the West, while Armenia's energy, trade, security, labor, core economic dependencies are all tied to Russia. We can say Eurasian Economic Union, but primarily that's going to mean Russia for Armenia. So the question here is, does Moscow view Armenia's continuing Western pivot as something that Armenians want, that Pashinyan has a vision, or is this like a Maidanization of Armenia? It's a Western operation just so that Armenia becomes a tool against Russia.
Well, I think the latter is much more correct. We see many comparisons between Pashinyan's policies and the policies conducted by a previous Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, in 2000s. By the way, lots of similarities, both in domestic politics and in foreign policy, right? Because we remember that Saakashvili came to power in Georgia as a result of colored revolution, pretty much like Pashinyan did. And Saakashvili, after a certain time, started to transform Georgia into a repressive authoritarian state. Just the same what Pashinyan is doing, right?
That's
because
right.
Pashinyan is trying to eradicate political opposition. There are repressions against opposition going on in Armenia.
It's
And
a
the foreign
cookie.
policy.
It's like a a pattern. It's a project plan which is being
Sure.
implemented milestone by milestone, phase
By
by
the way,
phase.
yes, absolutely. In Ukraine, by the way, a similar situation, right? No elections and the dictatorship of Zelensky. So, and in foreign policy, also Armenia is becoming a pawn of the Western players. And unfortunately, our major discontent with Pashinyan is that he makes Armenia an expendable. He makes Armenia an instrument of the Western policy against Russia, contrary to the objective interests of the Armenian people and the Armenian nature, because it would be suicidal for Armenia in its very complicated geopolitical surroundings, having Azerbaijan and Turkey nearby, to antagonize Russia and Iran, the countries which are interested in Armenian survival, safety, and security, and who are Armenian friends and have been supporting Armenia throughout decades, right? And Pashinyan's pivot to the West and the fact that Pashinyan allows the West to start using Armenia as a pawn undermines the relations between Armenia and Russia and Armenia and Iran without actually improvement, without significant improvement or qualitative improvement of the Armenian Azerbaijani and Armenian Turkish relations, because I do not see right now, and I do not anticipate in the observable future, any honeymoon between Armenia and Turkey, right? But at the same time, Armenia persistently undermines relations with both Russia and Iran. This is definitely against the national interests of Armenia. You're absolutely right. After the re-election, after the parliamentary elections, the current Armenian government doubled down on the policy which they had started even before, which is pivot to the European Union, to the West, not just European Union, but also to the United States, increasingly, turn to the West, while keeping their membership in the Eurasian Economic Union so far as long as they need it, as long as there is no replacement. And that's the contradiction which you identified, right? Because economically, Armenia is integrated with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, right? But politically, Pashinyan wants to strengthen and does strengthen relations with the European Union and the United States, and wants to keep Armenian membership in the Eurasian Economic Union, and wants to preserve economic relations with Russia as a temporary measure in order to make this turn more comfortable for Armenia, right? And he doesn't conceal that that this membership in the Eurasian Economic Union and preservation of relations with Russia is a temporary measure. That's not a strategic choice. That's a temporary means, right? And Pashinyan claims that when time comes, he will make a decision, right? Or the Armenian government will make a decision of whether to continue cooperation with Russia and membership in the Eurasian Economic Union or not. From the Russian perspective, we are not interested in such a play, right? We are not interested in basically paying for the Armenian reorientation to the European Union. We don't want to make this turn comfortable for the current Armenian government. This is why the Russian message is make the choice now, right? If you make a strategic choice proved by the national referendum. This is why Vladimir Putin is talking about referendum and encouraged Armenia to conduct a referendum. If Armenia conducts the referendum and the result of the referendum is European Union, then there is a clear situation. And unfortunately, Armenia will be no longer perceived by Russia as a friendly country with all the relevant circumstances. At the same time, if the national referendum claims that Armenia should stay with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, then of course the official Yerevan should recalibrate its foreign policy, right? And we do not, of course, demand the cancellation of Armenian relations with the West. Of course not, right? We simply do not want Armenia to be the pawn of the Western unfriendly, to put it mildly, policy vis-a-vis Russia.
You know, what's interesting about being a pawn is that everyone seems to be demanding that Armenia have a referendum or a constitutional change. Aliyev wants to have something on paper that says Armenia has no demands on Azerbaijan because he wants something on paper because he doesn't believe that Armenians believe that the outcome of the 2020 war is a cultural shift. He doesn't believe that. And Putin doesn't believe that Armenians really believe that they need to disconnect from Russia. So everybody wants the voice of the people to be heard rather than this shill of a government that
well,
is.
from the Russian perspective, Pashinyan, when he talks about the desirability of integration with the European Union, that he does not reflect the Armenian nation, the Armenian people. He reflects himself, right? Maybe a significant part of the Armenian nation, but not necessarily the overwhelming majority. So this is why we're interested in a referendum, in a democratic referendum, by the way. From the Russian perspective, the latest elections in Armenia were not 100% democratic because they were conducted in conditions of repressions, right? In conditions of threats, imprisonment of the participants, and so on.
Yeah. Dr. Suslov, on that matter, so far, Vladimir Putin has withheld congratulating Pashinyan or even recognizing the results. But I believe from the Pashinyan-Mishustin meeting, which happened in Yekaterinburg, I think we can surmise that that recognition, at least, will be forthcoming in the future, or some kind of a statement from Putin will be forthcoming. And as part of the Mishustin meeting, we also, like, Mishustin underscored that they expect the Armenian government to be more, to conduct more friendly, I guess, more cooperative policies with Russia. What do you think? Is there some kind of a barter going on in terms of what is expected from the Armenian side in order for the Russian government to formally at least acquiesce that Pashinyan is the leader of Armenia and it will deal with it in the next 5 years?
Well, I think that as long as Pashinyan is the leader of Armenia, and as long as Pashinyan conducts the policy, which he conducts, right, which is reorientation towards European Union and the United States, Russia is unlikely to revise the restrictive measures which it has implemented already vis-a-vis Armenia, because again, Russia is not interested in helping Pashinyan in making this reorientation comfortable, right? At the same time, I think there is a modus vivendi in terms of not to accelerate the conflict too much. Because Russia is not interested in a clash, right? Russia is not interested in a big conflict with Armenia. Russia is still interested in Armenia as a partner, as an ally, and as a brotherly nation. Russia is not interested in a quick withdrawal of the Russian military base, for instance, in Armenia, and it is still there. It is still there in Gyumri. Russia is not accelerating the expel, right, and the procedure of expelling Armenia from the Eurasian Economic Union, although Russia takes punitive measures. So I think that there are, or restrictive measures. I think that there is some modus vivendi, some workable modus vivendi with Pashinyan, with which Russia is not satisfied, but it is better than what could be the alternative. However, as we discussed above, Russia is still looking forward a referendum in Armenia. And referendum in the short-term period of time, not somewhere in the future like Pashinyan wants.
As a result of these elections, the Armenian opposition itself has changed. Now, Samvel Karapetyan's Strong Armenia brings a corporate, business-minded, and economically pragmatic bloc into parliament, even though the combined opposition is still less than 1/3 of the total. So Pashinyan has almost carte blanche in most types of legislative measures in the parliament. But this new makeup, where the opposition leader is a business-minded person, is different from the more nationalistic and the Artsakh or Karabakh War veteran class that used to exist before. Um, but they're essentially the opposition collectively is still seen as not pro-Russian, but more towards more realistic in terms of Armenia's policies. But I want to ask, does Moscow see Samvel Karapetyan and his strong Armenia alliance as a more serious long-term partner than previous, let's say, Robert Kocharyan and the previous Karabakh War political class?
Look, from the Russian perspective, what is the fundamental difference between the opposition in Armenia and Pashinyan is that the opposition is Armenia-centric, right? They are not pro-Russian, they are pro-Armenian. Whether they are nationalist pro-Armenian like Robert Kocharyan and the Artsakh or the Karabakh originated politicians in Armenia, or more business-like Samvel Karapetyan, they are still pro-Armenian. They do not want Armenia to be sacrificed in the geopolitical battle of the big players. They want Armenia to prosper. They recognize the realities, the regional the realities, the economic realities. They do not want Armenia to be used in geopolitical battlefields. Unlike Pashinyan, who wants Armenia to be used as a pawn, as an instrument in the geopolitical battlefield. So Russia will work with any Armenia-oriented politician or a political movement or a political party in Armenia, which is popular, which is supported by the people. Of course, from the perspective of longer-term stability, the business-oriented ones, like Samvel Karapetyan, could be more comfortable to deal with, right? And moreover, they are the new people, right? The new people are usually better supported by the population than the old guard, right? So yes, of course, Russia will be very much eager to work with with Karapetyan and with the Armenian opposition. Well, but as I said, I mean, as a matter of principle, Russia will work and welcome everyone who represents the interests of Armenia as a country, the interests of Armenia as a state, not the interests of the European Union through Armenia.
Dr. Suslov, during the Kocharyan and Sargsyan presidencies, the West actively cultivated oppositions and NGOs that eventually culminated in the current Pashinyan regime that is going on. So they really were very actively with them. In general, Russia prefers to deal with the government rather than the opposition. But here currently, we have an opposition in Karapetyan and Kocharyan who would like to develop relations with Russia. They're not necessarily going to stop or anything. It's not going to be a zero-sum situation for Armenia. Armenia has had a policy or diplomacy of complementarity since 1998, essentially. How come Russia is so hands-off? Is it because they think, oh, well, we can work with Pashinyan because he doesn't work against us, but maybe at present some red lines may seem to have been crossed? I'd like to know why it's quite hands-off and just kind of watching what's going on rather than saying that these people are friendly to us, these people are not.
Well, or at least condemning. I mean, I know that Russia has condemned, but we are seeing unprecedented pressure against opposition members, arrests, humiliating treatment of them, going into their own houses and putting them on the floor and then just walking them to their car.
So we have a situation of criminalizing the opposition, jailing them, lawfare, as you like to say, Hovig.
Yeah.
Well, I said before that from the Russian perspective, Pashinyan is building an authoritarian repressive regime, that he is conducting repressions against the opposition. He wants the opposition to be eradicated and put in jail, right? And I made a comparison with Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia before. I think that Pashinyan is going the same path. Why is Russia not interfering much, as you said, right? This is due to the long-term patterns and traditions of foreign policy, which is indeed non-interference into domestic affairs. Which is maybe it is a weak sign, a weak aspect of Russian foreign policy, but that's really the fact. The West, unlike Russia, is really, interference and penetration into the domestic affairs is a crucial instrument of the Western policy, not just in Armenia, but elsewhere in the post-Soviet space and beyond the post-Soviet space, right? Building NGOs, building opposition, using that in the projection and promotion of the Western interests is a crucial component of the Western foreign policy, which results into colored revolutions, which results into the destabilizations, sometimes in state failures. But that's the way for the West to project its interests. Russia lacks that tradition because respect of state sovereignty, a very Westphalian approach towards international relations has been and partially continues to be a prominent feature of Russian foreign policy. I personally think that that's a weakness of Russia, that Russia probably would have been more effective in projecting its interests through the influence on civil societies and oppositions and so on, rather than what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now, right? But indeed, due to patterns and due to the conceptual approaches to international relations, it's quite difficult for Russia to shift and to fundamentally transform its foreign policy in this regard. I hope it might change in the observable future, because the international relations are objectively changing. I think that Russia should work with the Armenian opposition much more actively than Russia is doing right now. I think that there are no illusions with Pashinyan as a counterpart. So we'll see.
Yeah. Dr. Suslov, EU is offering Armenia tariff relief, infrastructure grants, and credit lines. These are measures that are framed as a way to reduce Armenia's dependence on Russia and soften the impact of the Russian trade restrictions that are in place right now. But Armenia's economy remains deeply tied to Russia through exports, remittances, gas, labor access, transport realities, and the wider Eurasian Economic Union integration. And the question is whether the EU can actually, in reality, replace all these structures, or whether it is offering short-term relief, a sort of a mirage to quell the Armenian business population. And this relief cannot match the depth of the Eurasian integration. What are your thoughts? Can EU tariff relief and funding replace Russian markets?
I think that the measures of the European Union are very symbolic, limited, and political, in order indeed to make an impression that Europe could become an alternative. In fact, it cannot, because you cannot deny geography. And you cannot deny the fact that the European agricultural market is perhaps the most protectionist and restricted market in the world. Of course, Armenian geopolitical position is that Russia is nearby and Turkey is nearby. And by the way, Turkey is not a member of the European Union and will not become. in any observable future. I don't think that Turkey would be eager to open its market and to replace Russia uh, as a market for the Armenian goods. I think Turkey produces much of the things which Armenia produces itself, like fruits, apricots, lots of other stuff, wine even, and so on. As for Europe, objectively, Europe is not interested in opening its market for Armenia, and Europe is too far, right? Europe is too far, whereas Russia is nearby. Moreover, it's not just pure trade. It is a de facto deep integration of businesses. This is investments. This is the whole ecosystem of economic relations. You just can't replace it overnight. So, and by the way, this is the reason why Pashinyan wants to continue Armenia to stay in the Eurasian Economic Union while he deepens relations with the EU, because it's impossible to reorient in a short period of time. So the short question is, European Union cannot replace Russia as an alternative for Armenian goods. And look at Ukraine and Georgia again, right? Georgia was one of the most advanced countries in the post-Soviet space in terms of approximation with the EU legislature. But it has a deep and comprehensive free trade area with the European Union under the association agreement, which they had signed many years ago. Who are the major trade partners of Georgia? Not the European Union, but again, Turkey and Russia, or Russia and Turkey, right? Despite the fact that they have the DCFTA with the European Union, because you can't deny geography and you can't overcome the European restrictions. And I know this situation very well. Georgia failed in convincing the European Commission that Saperavi was wine and that Suluguni was cheese. They failed, right, to convince the European Commission of that, right? And they can't export their stuff. Armenia will be in the same situation if it goes that path. Also, look at Ukraine. Is the EU agricultural market open for Ukrainian goods? No. And the Eastern and Central and Eastern European countries like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, no matter what is the government there, is very much against the liberalization of trade with Ukraine. So again, it's impossible to open the agricultural market of the European Union, and it's impossible to deny geography.
Let's turn our attention a little bit to the TRIPP project, Dr. Suslov. It's not just an Armenian domestic infrastructure. It's not just a little issue that concerns Armenians. It's basically part of the East-West corridor, the Zangezur corridor, the Turanic corridor, the NATO corridor, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it intersects Russia's position in the South Caucasus. It's the Eurasian Economic Union's connectivity to Iran, and it puts the keys right there in the hands of the United States. So Russian officials have spoken about the possible participation in the TRIPP project, because it's also essentially the same thing that the trilateral statement, the ceasefire statement of November 2020 was, point 9. The key question is how Moscow views this. Does Russia see TRIPP as an ordinary piece of infrastructure or as a strategic line of containment that changes the balance in the South Caucasus?
Well, first, we consider TRIPP as a violation of the Sochi agreement, as a ceasefire agreement, because the ceasefire agreement entailed that this infrastructural corridor linking Azerbaijan with its Nakhichevan region through the Armenian territory will be under the Russian control, or was considered to be under the Russian control and supervision, and as a part of the Russian and Eurasian or Russia-centric and Eurasian infrastructural developments in the region. TRIPP is not, right? Although geography is similar, the political meaning is different. TRIPP is supposed to be controlled by the United States. No Russian participation, right? And as I said, that's the violation of the 2020 agreement. And moreover, I think this American control will be shared with Turkey. And we've discussed before the role of Turkey as a regional rival for Russia in South Caucasus. The TRIPP project controlled by the United States will contribute to the strengthening of the role of Turkey in South Caucasus and building and projecting the Turkish influence in the South Caucasus and moving beyond to the Caspian region and Central Asia. So Russia is quite concerned about this project and considers it unfriendly. We discuss it with the United States, but without any illusions. You know, as I said before, the Trump administration is also trying to undermine and replace Russia and undermine the Russian influence and presence in South Caucasus. The American policies largely remain unfriendly. So this is how we approach this project.
Let me make a very quick comment about that trilateral statement of 2020.
Sure.
You do say that it was essentially a violation of that agreement, but that agreement was violated so early and so many times that I just don't see exactly how any part of it remains valid. Prisoners of war were never released on the part of Azerbaijan. The line of demarcation was not held, the November 10 line of demarcation. Everything was abrogated. So
and Nagorno-Karabakh Republic no longer exists.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. We're not even, that's another show. So is Russian participation in the TRIPP a red line for Russia? Is it a bargaining chip? Is it a condition for accepting Armenia's new political reality? How do you view this?
Well, Russia is not interested in withdrawal, right, and in nullifying its presence. So if there is a way for Russian participation in this project, I think Russia would be eager to consider that. As I said, that's one of the points of the US-Russian negotiations about the broader issues beyond Ukraine. And there are such negotiations that could be some of the modus vivendi in Russian-Armenian relations in the new situation when Russian influence in the South Caucasus is weaker and Russian influence in Armenia objectively is weaker than it used to be. But as I said, I mean, Russia is not interested in just a complete withdrawal, and Russia understands that if it simply criticizes the TRIPP projects and demands its complete revision, probably it will not be accomplished. So let's discuss some way of Russian participation. So yeah, I mean, Russia could be interested in playing a role in this project, making it, I would say, less dangerous eventually for Armenia. Because if this project turns into the corridor of the projection of the Turkish influence in the region, it will be not in favor or in favor of the Armenian long-term interests.
Dr. Suslov, thank you for being with us already for 50 minutes. I hope you can entertain one or two more questions about the longer term. We talked a little bit about the Russian-EU potential confrontation. Now, Russia presents Europe as a declining periphery of the Western order, and but we see Europe is rearming. Poland is expanding its military role. Turkey is active from the Black Sea to the Caucasus, including through geo-economic projects, and NATO allies are taking more initiative. In fact, Germany is now, there are talks about Germany being nuclear armed. So under this possible NATO 3.0 model, where the US is encouraging its partners to manage the regional security, more directly, we think this could create a more fragmented but also aggressive and less predictable containment line around Russia. Is Russia underestimating the rearming of Europe, especially Poland, Germany, and Turkey?
We are taking the remilitarization, the rearmament of Europe very seriously. Actually, from the Russian perspective, the confrontation between Russia and Europe could be very long term as a result of this remilitarization. The current elites in Europe definitely want to turn the EU into a new Reich, right? They want to use, by the way, they want to continue long-term confrontation with Russia in order to stay in power themselves and in order to deepen the European integration in the military and defense area and turn the European Union into some kind of new federation, into a proto-state, right? The project which failed so far, but they think that this illusionary threat from Russia and the confrontation with Russia on the one hand, and the changed transatlantic relations, the objective crisis and transformation of the transatlantic relations, on the other hand, will create favorable preconditions for the deepening of the European integration. So European Union really, under the current elites, is becoming more consolidated, more militarized. The conventional military power and potentially nuclear power of European Union will rise, while keeping and even strengthening confrontation with Russia in the long term, right? Even beyond the war in Ukraine. And that's very important that, for instance, NATO summit in Ankara claimed Russia a long-term threat, right? Long-term also means beyond the war in Ukraine. So the relations thus are very likely to remain adversarial. European elites are interested in keeping those relations adversarial. The military threat vis-a-vis Russia from Europe, both through Ukraine and directly, because Ukraine will be kept as a European big pawn in this confrontation with Russia. You know, this threat will persist. It will create preconditions for dialogue in the future, for dialogue about management of this confrontational relationship, elements of arms control, deconfliction mechanisms, and so on and so forth. But having said all that, that's just one scenario, which is plausible, but not without alternatives. Because the implementation of this scenario is based on the current elites preserving their power. And I already said that the current elites in Europe, they are interested in deepening and accelerating confrontation with Russia in order to stay in power. Because objectively, they are losing. They are losing popularity. Look at the rating of German Chancellor Merz. It's 13%, right? He is the most unpopular Chancellor of Germany since the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, right? The same in France. Emmanuel Macron is the least popular president of the Fifth Republic. Keir Starmer in UK is one of the most unpopular prime ministers in Britain. So they understand that they are very unpopular, and they want to use the confrontation with Russia as a means to preserve their power. But if they lose their power, if there are new elites coming to power in major European countries, then we might have a different scenario, right? For instance, if Alternative for Germany or Front National come to power in Germany and France, then we will have different European Union, less integrated, less militarized, and more positive relations with Russia. So the trajectory, the future of Russia-Europe relations will ultimately depend on domestic situation in the major European countries. If the current elites keep their power, then we have the confrontational scenario and the new Cold War. And a big risk of the Cold War transforming into a hot war. If we have the change of leaderships in the major European countries, then we have less centralized European Union, more national-oriented governments in the major European countries, and much better relations with Russia. Not a return to the status quo ante, but partial normalization, and I would say quite crucial normalization between Russia and Europe.
Dr. Suslov, look, we had Pashinyan, whose popularity ranged between 15 and 35%, let's just say 25%, and look what happened. They could do similar things in Europe to re-elect their very unpopular governments.
Well, this is why actually there is a discourse about prohibition of the most popular parties in Europe, like AfD, right? It is the most popular political party in Germany, and they propose to prohibit it simply in order for the current elites to keep the power.
Yeah. Now, this pivot to the West is certainly a political movement. What would Russia need to offer Armenia to make Eurasian integration attractive again? It's obviously not the economics of it, it's the politics of it. But how does that, what's the way forward for Armenia and Russia together?
Well, I think that Russia can and will offer to Armenia security. Despite the Russian preoccupation with Ukraine, Russia will continue to exist. Russia will be the geopolitical reality in Caucasus at large. Russia will not disappear. Russia will not collapse. Turkey and Azerbaijan will continue to be long-term threats and challenges for the Armenian security. And in order to deal with them, Armenia will need allies. And as I said before, there is no replacement for Russia as an ally and the means to guarantee Armenian survival and security. So first and foremost, Russia could offer security to Armenia. Secondly, in the increasingly fragmented world, there is no way for countries, even big countries, let alone small countries like Armenia, to survive on its own. We are in the period of regional integration and regional integrations. Since the chance for Armenia to become a full member of the European Union is less than zero, I see no alternative for Armenia than the Eurasian Economic Union, actually as the way to preserve Armenian competitiveness, to preserve and to stimulate Armenian economic development. And look, Armenia is still a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, and Armenia prospered lately, right? That's a paradox, right? Pashinyan wants to orient vis-a-vis the West, whereas the reasons for Armenian growth during the recent time is due to Armenian relations with Russia and Armenian membership right. in the Eurasian Economic Union. And I think it's very it's necessary for the Armenian people to recognize them, right? Pashinyan deceives them in saying that he is the reason for their prosperity. It is not. It is the relations with Russia and Armenian membership in the Eurasian Economic Union, which Pashinyan now sacrifices or wants to sacrifice in the future for the sake of the implementation of not even the Armenian interests, but the interests of the European elites. So definitely security, definitely economic development, plus also cultural heritage. You know, Armenia is the most ancient Christian nation, right? It's the first country in the world to have adopted Christianity. European Union in its current phase, in its current stage, I would say is culturally different from what the Armenian values and the Armenian cultural heritage has always been. So this cultural connectivity and commonality is also a crucial, I think, pillar of the Russian-Armenian relations.
So a final question. If Russia defeats Ukraine, finally, and that conflict is resolved to Russia's satisfaction, but in the meantime loses Armenia, Moldova, influence in other parts of the South Caucasus, et cetera, Is that going to be a strategic win for Russia?
Well, first, I don't think that Russia will lose Armenia and Moldova forever. All right. Today we are at the stage when the Russian influence is weakened in those countries without question. However, look at the Russian-Georgian relations, right? I've already repeated several times, you can't deny geography and you can't deny geopolitics and the objective realities. After the Russian-Georgian war in August 2008, there was a conviction that the relations are over, that the relations are destroyed whatsoever. Yes, we still lack diplomatic relations. But, I mean, paradoxically, Russian-Georgian relations are today the most stable and probably the best in the South Caucasus. So there, at the same time, there is a very, very deep crisis of the Georgian West relations because Georgia doesn't want to become a pawn, right? So nothing is irreversible. And I'm sure that there will be a normalization and the creation of a new modus vivendi in Russia's relations with Armenia and Moldova. What I hope for is that the way there will be not such problematic one than the one as was between Russia and Georgia. I do not want a Russian-Armenian military conflict.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I personally have at least 2 more hours in me of topics and questions, but that just means we're going to have to ask you back on the show sometime soon.
I will
Dr. Suslov,
definitely
thank you
come
so
back.
much for joining us.
Thank you. It was
Thank
my
you, Dr.
pleasure.
Suslov.
Thank you very much.
The pleasure was all ours, but thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on July 9, 2026. Folks, thank you for staying with us. That was a very interesting show.
Thank you for listening. Shnorakalutun spasiba. And thank you in any language that you speak. We appreciate your confidence in us regarding our dedication to bring you these what we think are intelligent and independent conversations and analysis on Armenian news. Frankly, I would like to gloat a little bit more because we don't find English language content like this too much on the internet, and we are going, both Osped and I are going out of our way to bring this to you completely free. And in exchange for that, if you can afford it, we would appreciate if you could support us, which will allow us to improve the pace at which we produce these episodes, which will allow us to increase our reach. It will allow us to produce more content for you. So, and obviously we will also be able to measure the level of thanks we get for producing this content, which is, nice to see some money rolling in.
It's a real show of support, so we appreciate that. Even though it's absolutely not mandatory, it's entirely up to you. But go ahead and support us by liking the show, sharing the show, commenting on our shows. And Hovik, remind me, because I don't even remember that new method of supporting a show. What was it called?
It's called Hype. So if you see,
I was remembering Vibe.
On YouTube, on the app only, you get to do 3 hypes a week, and we will be honored if one of those hypes came to us. Frankly, it's still a big bar for us to cross because we have to get like 100,000 hype points in order to be featured by YouTube or pushed up by YouTube. But hey, one step at a time. So, try to give us a hype and let's see how far we get. It still feels nice to get some hype sometimes, so we appreciate it.
So just for the record, we've been talking with Dr. Dmitry Suslov, who is a Russian political scientist, a foreign policy analyst, and commentator specializing in great power politics. The entire bio is in our show notes. Please go to podcast.groong.org/episode number, and you can click on his bio, you can click on my bio, you can click on Hovik's bio, and we also put any kind of link, news articles, references, etc. in the show notes. Okay, well, I'm Osped Bedrosian, and
I'm Hovik Monocharyan.
Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.